understand all the root causes that have led us to this crisis, because the solution also needs to account for these root causes. Other than what crises are, we also look at who the actors are. In a traditional approach, most of the time and overwhelmingly, we look at external philanthropic partners coming in, trying to manage the situation in that moment, and then stepping out after getting to, let's say, a satisfactory place where, all right, we're returning to seemingly a normal state. Within a feminist response, the actors are not external. They are internal, they are embedded within the community, they are part of that community, they are held accountable to the community. They've been there for a while, they understand the reasons leading to the crisis. So the goal is not just to focus on that moment of rupture, but looking also deeper. And also the idea is we're not necessarily always hoping to go back to a normal state, because that normal was most of the time even unjust for the communities there. Our hope is for a future that is more equitable and that is more sustainable. And the third difference would be how our response and what should we do. In traditional approaches, we look more into stabilizing the situation. We just want to come in, we want to stabilize, and then we want to step out. Within a feminist crisis response, we don't stop at survival. Care is very important, but also is justice. And we wanna adopt a human, people-centered approach that is making the world and the context more just and equitable for all those affected by it. But also that means we have to understand how everyone is affected and why some people might be affected more than others, and have our response designed and adapted so it could really benefit everyone there.
Thank you very much, Johnny. So Johnny was starting to get to the piece around kind of justice and equity, and I think that's where we want to go next. And that's just one of the takeaways from the research, if you read it, is that neutrality in aid is very much a myth. When we're looking at different kinds of crises that are happening around the world, there's very political reasons that they're happening, or they might be escalating, right? But often it's sort of framed as like we can only respond to them as neutral actors, and that's the only fair way to do it. And what we are kind of be saying that, right, we're not actually. What we're doing is we're looking at how we respond politically as well as fund politically. And I'm going to turn actually to Lucy to kind of say a bit more about what we mean when we say that crisis is inherently political, and then we'll kind of walk out some examples of what that looks like in real time.
Thank you, Celia. So when we're saying that crises are inherently political, we're really pointing to two things. So first, we're saying that crises themselves are not neutral. They're the result of political decision-making. Sometimes that is very explicit and very obvious. I think we've seen that within the recent US attacks on Iran. But also those crises that we describe maybe as things like natural disasters, so things like floods or wildfires, are very much a result of political choices. So if we think about decisions to invest in fossil fuels, to invest in extractive industries, to prioritize profit over people and planet, all those things drive a precarity that results in those crises that we see. The second point is just as important, and that's that crises are also used politically. So, for example, what we've seen in Myanmar, in Sudan, in Syria, in Gaza, is that those actors that have been responsible for the humanitarian crises have then weaponized aid for their own political and military advantages. And this is where the idea of a neutrality trap comes in. So if humanitarian actors respond as if crises are neutral, as if they're technical events, then it leaves them without the tools or the mandate to be able to address those political roots of crisis or the way that crises are being used to advance anti-rights agendas. So in the research, we call for a broadening of our understanding of humanitarian response, where we move beyond just a single version of neutral humanitarianism to really embrace forms of communal humanitarian response where equity, rights, and justice are at the fore. Because ultimately, if we don't acknowledge those politics of crisis, we risk responding in ways that treat the symptoms, whilst leaving those root causes and those power structures that drive crises completely intact.
Thank you, Lucy. And I'm going to turn to you, Carol, because I know you have some great examples around how feminist movements do successfully tackle those root causes.
Yeah. Thank you, Celia. So first of all, I want to say that when it comes to grassroots movements and women's rights organizations, their work is usually invisibilized. A lot of time they do amazing work because they are closer to the problem. They have the strategies to address those problems. But however, they have limited or no access to resources. So when crises actually happen, they are the first one to be impacted, and the first one to be impacted and the first ones to respond, yet they don't have resources. And we know very well, crises don't hit everyone equally. So first, it's deeply structurally political, the way Lucy has mentioned, and actually money follows attention. So whoever is covered in the global media, whoever is covered in media gets the attention and hence gets the money. However, when it comes to grassroots organizations, because they are not getting the attention, because they are not being covered, they won't receive the resources. So yet we see with over 27 years of work that actually change happens and together with actually grassroots women's rights organizations and grassroots feminist movements. So just to give you an example, in South Africa, the GBV crisis is one of the worst in the world. So when you come to femicide, for example, it is 5 times worse in South Africa compared to anywhere in the world. When it comes to, for example, just statistics, per year that is reported is around 53,000, cases of GBV that actually are reported, and research and documentation has shown that this is actually underreported. So the statistics are higher than the 53,000 that have been captured officially by the government. So there was this in 2025 feminist movement led by 5 powerful women who don't have an office. They operate online, and they decided, no, we have a chance to actually organize ourselves, even if we are only 5 of us. But trust me, 5 women going to donors and asking for money, they are not going to get it. First of all, they are not registered, so they are not going to get resources. But because of who we are as UAF, UAFs, we actually support both registered and non-registered organizations, or formal or non-formal organizations. So in 2025, this group of 5 women approached UAF Africa. So they wanted some resources to actually organize a march and petition the government about this, pandemic called GBV in South Africa. So we were able to give them resources, and they organized a march around Women's Day in 2025, where they did a campaign around unburying the truth. So that was the title of the campaign. And they actually, there were many of them, they were able to pull a lot of women to actually go to the street and march to the Union Building carrying a casket. And this casket was 36% larger than the usual casket. And just to drive a point home that you are actually killing us. So because they were trying to drive a point around femicide. So in this casket, they put petitions. So it was filled with petitions from different women and girls about the issues of femicide. So they presented it wherever. So they wanted the government to actually declare femicide a national disaster. Whereas it was not declared a national disaster during that, March 2025 protest. In April, they actually got an online petition again, which garnered about 185, signatures. They again petitioned the government, and in August 2025, the government actually set aside 700 million rands, which is about 420 million American dollars, to actually as a budget because we know very well where there is no resources, there's also no implementation and priority. So having resources really means a lot to then continue to push for this, to document and also acknowledge that actually this is an issue. So having a budget, a huge budget like that, was an acknowledgement by the government that indeed this is an issue and we are taking it seriously and we want to address this. And this was driven by 5 women who don't have a registered organization, they don't have a space, but they organize online. So that kind of resistance, that kind of push, that kind of, tenacity is the kind of organizations that actually UAFs support across the world. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Carol. I actually didn't know the full story of that one, so I appreciated hearing that example around addressing the root causes of gender-based violence, and also, the kind of turn to make it into the health crisis disaster that it actually is. Lucy, I'm actually going to go over to you now. I'm mixing it up a little. So we're going to talk a bit about rethinking the crisis continuum, because in the research we did, Lucy did a lot of work and kind of working with us and to think about how crises don't just start with like a conflict right now, right? They start with history. There's a lot behind when you see a conflict erupt. There's so much that's already happened, and that's the case with every crisis. And so, yes, how does the humanitarian sector and the philanthropic sector need to shift their understanding of that long-standing structural harm that leads to driving crises?
Thank you. So I think one of the things that's really clear if we look at the data at the moment is the fact that philanthropy is treating crises as if they're these discrete, freestanding events. So we talk about some really kind of striking data within the research, including, including some data from 2022 from Candid and the Centre for Disaster Philanthropy. And what that shows us is that 90% of funds go to response and relief efforts. Just 1% go to resilience, risk reduction and mitigation, 1% to preparedness, and 2% to reconstruction. So one just incredibly powerful thing for funders to change is around when we resource crisis, if we're only showing up at that point where crises erupt, we're not responding effectively.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to Johnny now and just give us a little more on what that means.
Yes, thank you, Celia. And to jump into what Lucy was saying, we believe that philanthropy needs to stop treating crises as these interruptions and start looking at them as patterns. And the report does draw on that a lot in terms of the idea that crises do not float alone and freely in history. They are long-term processes, that they are linked across time. And we often call a crisis like this visible eruption of deeper structural patterns and harms that have been accumulating for years and generations. But also for philanthropy, that means moving beyond thinking about that mindset of what happened for this particular emergency to erupt, and thinking more about what are the conditions that had led us throughout time for this what we know now was almost inevitable for it to happen if we look closer into all the history of these crises. And it's a really fundamentally different question when we think about it from that perspective, and it pushes donors to engage more with structural violence, with historical exclusion and long-term precarity that we're always seeing. But I feel also it demands a sense of humility, to be frank, from donors and from actors within philanthropy. As donors, we don't only strive to fund in these moments of disaster, and we cannot do that without, by ignoring history of occupation, of oppression, of extractive practices, of anti-gender backlash or attacks on civic space, all of which we are able to see and even predict. As Urgent Action Sister Funds, we are often connected to advisors and trusted community partners that are able to start seeing those indicators of a crisis that is about to erupt. And we're not just waiting for that to happen. So we're thinking on this spectrum, on this continuum of crisis, and not just in that one moment of rupture.